Welcome to EasyViz Tableau Tips. This video will show you how to make dynamic measures and labels. If you want to follow along, we're using the Superstore dataset. I have a data source with many different measures. I want to create a visualization that will show one measure at a time that can dynamically change based on a dropdown. In today's video, I'll show you how you can set this up and we'll explore how to overcome some challenges along the way. So let's start with a new sheet. First thing we're going to need is a parameter that we can toggle between. Our parameter is going to be type string. It's going to be a list, and we're going to use the same values as our measures. Discount, profit, quantity, sales, and order count. We'll rename our parameter select measure. Next, we're going to need a measure that's going to dynamically change based on our parameter. So to do this, we create a calculated field, and we're going to use a simple if statement to check the value of the parameter and then return the corresponding measure. We'll call this dynamic measure for now. Now let's create a simple visualization using that dynamic measure. We'll drag the dynamic measure into columns, and then we'll use the state and province as our dimension. Next, we need to expose the parameter that we just created. And now we can see, depending on what parameter we select, it will bring us the correct measure associated with it. One cool thing about dynamic measures is you can actually just sort your dynamic measure, and when you change the parameter, it'll keep that same sorting preference. One issue you'll face is when you try to use labels. Let's drag the dynamic measure into labels, and let's select a small number like order count. This seems to work fine, but when you select a large number like sales, you can see the numbers in the labels aren't correctly formatting the same way as our scale does. To work around this problem, we're going to need a dynamic label. So we're going to create a calculated field, and the formula looks something like this. We're going to check if the dynamic measure is over 1 billion. If so, we're going to divide it by 1 billion. Then we're going to check if it's over 1 million, and then divide it by 1 million. Then we'll check if it's over 1,000, and we'll divide it by 1,000. Otherwise, we just bring back the dynamic measure. We're going to call this dynamic measure normalized. Let's drag that into labels and see what it looks like. Now you can see these numbers pretty much match these same numbers down here. Let's remove this old label and see how that looks. So you can see these numbers pretty much match, and if we go into our different measures, they all match. You can see order count is just leaving the original value until it's over 1,000, in which case it's dividing it by 1,000. And when it's under 1,000, it's just returning the values. And you can see this will work throughout all our measures. You can see what we're missing is the unit at the end of the dynamic measure. So we can create another calculated field that will dynamically change that unit. So we can use the same formula as we did before, except instead of returning the dynamic value divided by a number, we're going to return a unit instead. So for the billion one, we want to return B. For the million one, we want to return M. For the thousands, we'd like to return K. And finally, for anything under 1,000, we're just going to return blank. We'll rename this calculation dynamic measure suffix. And then we simply drag that into labels. And you can see it's on a different row, so we'll edit the label formatting, and we'll just bring those into the same row. Now we can see our dynamic measure is showing the label correctly with the correct suffix as well. If we go into order count, we can see that we have some values with a K and some values with a 0. This leads us to our next issue, these pesky little decimal points. To work around this, there's quite a simple little formatting trick we can use. Just right click format, and instead of showing automatic, we're going to use number standard. Now you can see that's removed most of these decimal points, but it shows all of the decimal points when we are looking at the values that we normalized. So if we go to sales, you can see all of these values that we divided out are showing. So to work around that, we can make a small modification to our normalization formula. We simply wrap this whole thing in a round to 1 decimal place. And now you can see any values that we normalize down are going to show at 1 decimal place, such as millions and billions, and any single values are just going to show with no decimal places. The next issue we encounter is if we look at a value like profit, we have negative values that aren't formatted properly. We can fix this pretty easily by wrapping our absolute value function around our dynamic measure. That way, whether it's positive or negative, it will correctly normalize the value. Here we can see it's correctly normalized the value, however it hasn't put the suffix on, so we have to make that same change into our suffix. So you can see I've just wrapped the dynamic measure in an absolute value function, and that way whether it's positive or negative, it'll correctly bring in the suffix. If you want to be super fancy, you can even create a dynamic prefix. To do this, we just create a formula that checks the parameter for certain values such as order count and quantity. For those, we just want to return a blank value, and for anything else, we just want to return the $sign. We'll call this dynamic measure prefix. Then we'll drag it into our label, and of course we need to format our label. This works pretty well. If we look at something like order count, we don't have the $sign, and if we look at a value like sales, we have our $sign. However, when we look at our smaller values over here under 1,000, they have one decimal place. It doesn't look too good with the $sign, so let's get rid of that decimal. To do this, we just go into our dynamic normalized measure, and instead of rounding it out here, we just want to round each value explicitly. To do this, we just put the rounding for all the large numbers to one decimal place, and the rounding for anything under 1,000 to 0 decimal places. And there we have it, no more decimals. Going back to our profit value, let's fix the issue with the little negative sign being after the $sign. First, we need to edit our dynamic normalized measure so that the negative sign is gone. To do this, we just wrap our dynamic measure in an absolute value function so it always returns a positive number. Now our negatives are gone. Now we need to re-add the negative before the $sign, so to do this, we edit our prefix. We'll make a slight modification to this formula. So now it checks if the dynamic measure is less than 0, it'll use a negative $sign, otherwise it'll use a positive $sign. Because we've now used an aggregation, we need to just re-drag this dynamic measure prefix onto our text box and redo the formatting. And just like that, our positive values are showing correctly, our decimals are showing correctly, and our negative values are showing correctly. And that's it. Now we have a single visualization that can dynamically toggle between multiple different measures, and it even has neat little labels that will dynamically change based on the different types of measure that you select. Thanks for watching. If you've learned something, please like and subscribe.